The airfield was alive with noise and tension, the sound of engines, the clatter of boots, the heavy murmur of soldiers moving with purpose under the glaring lights that spilled across the concrete. The SEAL team stood gathered near the hangar. There, Captain, a tall and imposing figure with weathered lines across his face, scanning each man with eyes that seemed to pierce through steel. He raised his voice above the chaos and asked a question that silenced the group in an instant. "Is there a combat pilot here?" The question hung in the night air like a challenge waiting to be answered. No one moved at first, and the silence stretched across the team like a heavy curtain. They exchanged quick glances, some curious, some unsure, the tension, thickening with every passing second. Then from the edge of the group, a clear, firm voice cut through the silence. It was the voice of a woman, and every head turned at once as if drawn by the force of something unexpected. She stepped forward, her boots steady her shoulders, squared her face unshaken by the stares that fell upon her. "I am a combat pilot," she said with a calm certainty that startled everyone. The men reacted instantly, some with disbelief, some with muffled laughter, and some with narrowed eyes that questioned her every word. A female pilot in the middle of a mission briefing was not something they had prepared to see, not something they had expected to hear. The captain turned his gaze on her, his eyes sharp and unyielding, as if he meant to test the truth of her claim. He asked again, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Is there a combat pilot here?" His tone suggested he doubted her, and yet she repeated herself with no hesitation. "I am the pilot." You need a ripple of unease moved through the group, the kind of unease that sparks when something familiar is suddenly challenged. The men who had flown countless missions together now stood uncertain, caught between their captain's demand and this unexpected response. The captain studied her a long moment, as if searching for weakness, as if waiting for her to falter. But her eyes never wavered. Her jaw remained firm, and her stance showed no crack of fear. The weight of that silence pressed down harder, until finally the distant roar of a helicopter shattered it, and every head turned toward the sound. The blades thundered closer, cutting through the air with a force that made the ground tremble. The helicopter loomed against the horizon like a beast, awakened from slumber, its lights flashing as it prepared for readiness. The captain's gaze shifted back to the woman, and without a word, he motioned her forward, a challenge written across his face, as though daring her to prove herself. Every man in the circle watched her every step as she moved toward the machine, their disbelief twisting into whispers that carried just loud enough to be heard, but not enough to stop her. Her boots struck the concrete with steady rhythm, each step echoing against the hangar walls like a drumbeat of defiance. The SEALs exchanged looks, some with smirks that spoke of doubt, others with eyes that narrowed in wary calculation. They had seen pilots before they had trusted men who carried years of battle, scars and stories that dripped with smoke and blood. But this was new, and new was dangerous. The woman climbed the ladder into the cockpit with the ease of someone who belonged, her hands moving with muscle memory, her focus sharp as a blade. The captain followed her, his movements slow, deliberate, as if testing her with his very presence. He strapped himself into the seat behind her. His jaw set his expression unreadable. The men outside leaned in closer, their bodies tense, their eyes watching for the smallest slip that would confirm their suspicion. The roar of the rotors filled the air, growing louder until it drowned out every whispered word, and yet in that rising storm the question still hung unspoken. Could she carry them through what was coming? Could she hold steady when the world tilted into chaos? She ran her hands across the controls, her fingers gliding as if tracing an old map she knew by heart. The hum of power surged through the machine as it came alive beneath her touch. The captain studied her every move, his suspicion sharp as a blade ready to cut at the first sign of weakness. But she did not falter her breath, even her posture unshaken, even as the helicopter lifted slightly, the vibrations rattling through the steel frame and into every bone. The men shifted uneasily, as if the ground itself had turned uncertain beneath them. The moment stretched longer than it should have, the bird hovering, the sound deafening, the weight of doubt still heavy in the eyes of those who watched. The captain leaned forward, his voice sharp near her ear. "Lives depend on you," he said, a reminder that was less warning and more test. She did not turn, she did not speak. She only pressed forward, her eyes locked on the horizon, where shadows stretched and mountains loomed dark and silent. The night carried secrets hidden in those ridges, and she knew every secret would demand a price. The helicopter steadied, then rose higher, cutting through the night air with force that rattled through the chest of every man watching. The crew below shielded their eyes from the blast of dust as the rotors churned and the ground seemed to fall away. The captain watched her hands on the controls, steady, precise, his face betraying nothing yet. His silence carried its own weight, a weight that pressed heavier than words. The woman felt it, but did not yield, her focus sharp on the horizon where danger waited unseen. The bird banked sharply to the left, her hands guiding it with a confidence that unsettled those who had doubted her movements. Had no hesitation, no falter. She flew as though the machine obeyed her without question. The SEALs exchanged glances one by one, their doubt colliding with the reality unfolding before them, yet none spoke aloud. Not yet. The night was only beginning and their faith had not yet been demanded, but the moment was coming fast. The captain finally broke the silence, his voice low but cutting through the roar above him. "This mission will test everything," he said, "and if you fail, we will not survive." The words hung heavy, but her response was silence, not from fear, not from doubt, but from focus. She leaned into the controls, the bird lifting into the darkness, carrying them toward mountains that held both enemy fire and destiny, waiting like a predator, unseen in the shadows. The men in the back of the bird fastened their gear, their faces hard, their eyes flicking to the pilot who now carried their fate in her hands. They whispered among themselves, words drowned out by the storm of the rotors, but their eyes betrayed the question none wanted to voice. Could she bring them back alive? Could she face what was waiting in the valley of fire and shadow? The night swallowed the helicopter whole, leaving only the echo of its thunder in the air, and the silence of those who remained staring after it. And as the horizon stretched before them, filled with dark ridges and secrets, the question remained unanswered, and the suspense pressed deeper, like a knife waiting to strike. The helicopter climbed into the night air, leaving the glowing airfield behind, swallowed by the horizon and the endless dark sky. The female pilot sat in the cockpit, her hands steady over the controls, her eyes locked ahead with an intensity that silenced even the whispers of doubt in the cabin. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her. The SEAL captain directly behind her, silent yet sharp, his presence pressing against her like a test. She had no choice but to pass. The bird rumbled with power beneath her touch, and she guided it forward with confidence that demanded notice. The desert stretched below them, vast and silent like an ocean of shadows. The moon hung high, casting faint light across jagged ridges and endless dunes. But it was not enough to comfort anyone inside the machine. The SEALs sat with their gear strapped tight, each man holding his own thoughts, but their eyes betrayed unease. They had flown into danger countless times, yet never under the hand of someone so unexpected. Doubt was a poison that spread quick in a team, and though none spoke it aloud, the silence between them told its own story. Static cracked in the comms, breaking through the roar of the rotors, and the mission briefing poured in. The target was a fortified compound, hidden deep in hostile territory, a stronghold crawling with enemies armed and waiting. Their task was to infiltrate, extract sensitive assets, and return without leaving a trace. But the odds stacked higher with every word that spilled through the comms. The pilot listened carefully, her grip never wavering as she steered through the dark valleys. The hum of the machine growing louder with every mile toward danger. The captain leaned forward, his voice near her ear low but hard, like steel. "Lives depend on you tonight," he said, and his tone left no space for mistakes. She did not flinch. She did not turn. She only nodded slightly, her jaw set, and her eyes fixed on the horizon. For her, this was not about proving her worth. It was about survival and about carrying those who did not believe in her into the heart of fire and back again. The night air outside seemed to thicken with every passing second. The terrain grew rougher, mountains rising like jagged teeth against the moonlit sky. The helicopter dipped low, hugging the ground, moving with precision through valleys where radar could not easily reach. The rotors cut the air with force that shook the cabin, but the pilot remained calm. Her movements measured each adjustment sharp and controlled. The SEALs watched her closely, some leaning forward, as if still waiting for the mistake that would confirm their doubts, but the mistake never came. Suddenly, a voice burst. Over the radio, warning of enemy patrols moving near the perimeter of their path, the captain swore under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he studied the display screens glowing faint in the dark. The pilot shifted the bird instantly, banking to the right, her instincts sharp like a blade. Her movements were fast yet controlled, and the men felt the sudden pull as their stomachs dropped. The helicopter glided low over the ridges, hugging shadows that seemed almost alive. The silence among the SEALs deepened as realization struck that her skill was undeniable. The desert wind slammed hard against the bird, rattling it with invisible fists. The men in the back tightened their grips, their boots, pressed against the floor as turbulence shook through the steel frame. Yet in the cockpit, her hands remained firm, her body unmoved, as though she were part of the machine itself. The captain studied her face, lit faintly by the glow of the instruments, and found no trace of fear, no crack in her focus. She was not flying to prove them wrong. She was flying because failure was not a word she allowed to exist. Another voice came through the radio, a clipped message filled with urgency. The compound. Ahead was on alert defenses, heightened enemies anticipating movement in the skies. The captain clenched his jaw, his thoughts racing through strategies, but his eyes drifted back to the pilot as though wondering if she could navigate them through what was now certain to be a storm of fire. She tightened her grip, her lips parting slightly as she exhaled, slow and steady like a soldier preparing to face the inevitable. The lights of the stronghold appeared faint in the distance, like stars scattered on the ground, but their glow carried danger that could swallow them whole. The pilot adjusted altitude, lowering the helicopter into deeper shadow, her eyes never leaving the horizon. The SEALs shifted in their seats, tightening straps, checking weapons, preparing for the moment when the ground would demand their presence. The captain leaned forward, speaking into the comms, issuing final orders, but his eyes never fully left the back of her head, as though he had already begun to wonder if she was the only reason they had made it this far. The ground below shifted into broken rock and narrow canyons, dangerous terrain, even without enemy fire. The bird swept between jagged walls, the sound of the rotors echoing through stone valleys with eerie force. The SEALs gritted their teeth, bracing for impact that never came, as she maneuvered through paths few pilots would dare. The captain felt his jaw tighten, but not from doubt, rather from the unsettling truth that she might actually be better than most of the men he had flown with before. Her breath grew heavier, but her hands did not tremble. She felt the machine respond to her every move like an extension of her own body. Yet she knew the true test had not yet begun. The stronghold loomed. Closer its walls crawling with guards, its defenses alive with power and precision. Each second carried them nearer to a place where one mistake would mean death, and she could feel the weight of that truth pressing harder against her chest. The comms crackled again this time, a warning filled with urgency. "Enemy radar has picked you up." The captain swore under his breath, barking orders to brace. But the pilot reacted before his words fully reached the men. She banked hard to the left, dropping altitude until the helicopter skimmed dangerously close to the canyon floor. Sparks lit from the underbelly as rock scraped against steel, but the machine held steady under her hand. The SEALs felt the world tilt, their bodies slamming against harnesses. Yet she did not falter, not even once. As the canyon walls closed tighter, the bird thundered forward through the shadows. Every second, a gamble, every movement, a battle against gravity and steel. Her eyes flicked across instruments, then back to the horizon, the glow of the compound, now brighter, larger, more threatening. The captain's hand tightened on his harness, his eyes locked on the glowing defenses ahead, knowing that the next few minutes would decide the fate of every soul on board. Night air grew thick with tension. The roar of the rotors louder than thought itself. The pilot's chest rose and fell, her breath heavy, her eyes alive with fire. She guided the bird with impossible precision, every motion deliberate, every risk calculated. Yet even as she pushed forward, she knew the worst had only begun. The compound now filled the horizon, its walls alive with spotlights, its weapons hungry for the sound of their arrival. And as the bird skimmed lower, the ground rushing beneath them, the captain finally realized that their lives no longer rested in his command, but in the hands of the woman who now carried them straight into the heart of danger, where fire and steel waited to greet them. The helicopter thundered across the night sky, the terrain below, twisting into narrow valleys and jagged ridges that rose like teeth against the dark horizon. The female pilot held the machine steady, her hands moving with precision, her focus unbroken as the SEALs behind her braced in silence. The captain watched her every move, his jaw clenched tight, his mind racing with the reality that each second carried them closer to death. Yet she showed no sign of hesitation. Not even when the first flashes of tracer fire lit up the sky ahead, the silence inside shattered with the sudden rattle of bullets slicing through the night, their glowing streaks cutting across the path like a wall of fire. The alarms screamed in the cockpit, flashing red warnings across her vision. But she did not panic. Instead, she yanked the bird into a dive, the sudden shift slamming the soldiers against their harnesses as the mountains rushed up toward them. The captain barked orders, his voice sharp and commanding, but she ignored him, her instincts faster, sharper. Her movements, weaving the helicopter through fire as though threading a needle in the dark tracer. Rounds followed them, relentless cutting closer every second. The machine shook violently, the sound of metal ringing as stray shots grazed its armor. The SEALs tightened grips on weapons, though there was nothing they could do but trust a pilot they still doubted. The canyon ahead narrowed dangerously, and for a breath it seemed certain the helicopter would crash against the stone walls. But at the last instant, she tilted the nose and slipped through the gap with impossible control, leaving the enemy fire sputtering behind them, swallowed by the shadows. The air inside the bird was heavy with disbelief. The captain's eyes bore into the back of her head as if trying to understand how she had just pulled them out of what should have been certain death. His men exchanged quick glances, some wide-eyed, some grim, but none spoke aloud. The pilot's face was lit faintly by the glow of the instruments. Her jaw set, her eyes locked forward as though she had already forgotten the danger that trailed behind, because she knew more was coming. Her radio crackled with harsh static before a voice pierced through enemy aircraft inbound. 2 bogies fast approaching. She did not flinch, her body leaning into the controls as the bird responded like it belonged to her. The captain swore under his breath, his grip on the harness tight as the reality struck. They were no longer fighting. Just ground fire. They were about to be hunted from the sky, and the odds were stacked beyond reason. The roar of engines filled the night. The enemy fighters closing fast, their lights faint specks that grew brighter with terrifying speed. The SEALs shifted uneasily, strapped in yet powerless against what was coming. The pilot scanned the horizon, her mind running faster than thought itself. Her helicopter was heavy, slower, less agile, but she knew the terrain below could become her ally if she trusted herself enough to use it. The captain leaned forward as if to issue orders, but stopped when he realized she was already moving. She dropped altitude hard, forcing the bird into a steep dive that made stomachs lurch. The canyon below rose up, with jagged cliffs like knives waiting to slice through steel. Yet she did not slow. Instead, she pushed the bird lower and tighter into the winding pass, forcing the enemy fighters to follow through terrain that favored risk over speed. The walls pressed close, the sound of rotors echoing off stone as sparks scattered from near collisions. The SEALs held their breath, caught between terror and awe. Missiles locked the warning alarms, blaring a piercing shriek that filled the cabin. The captain's voice cut through shouting evasive orders, but the pilot was already pulling the bird into a turn so sharp the world outside blurred. A missile streaked past, missing by inches, detonating against the cliff face and shaking the canyon with thunder. The helicopter rattled violently, dust and rock raining over them, yet she pressed forward, her jaw clenched, her eyes unyielding. The enemy fighters roared overhead, circling back for another strike. Their speed unmatched, their weapons deadly. But speed could be a weakness, and she knew it. She dragged the bird deeper into the canyon, twisting through narrow passages where only precision could save them. Her hands worked furiously, the helicopter dancing between stone and shadow with movements that defied what the machine was built for. The captain stared at her, his disbelief carved into his face as the reality struck that her skill was keeping them alive. Another missile streaked toward them, the glow cutting across the night like a viper. She yanked the bird sideways, the rotors scraping dangerously against the rock face, sparks bursting into the air. The missile clipped the canyon wall, detonating in a burst of fire behind them. The shockwave slammed into the helicopter, tossing it violently, but she fought the controls, forcing it steady. The SEALs were thrown against harnesses, groaning from the impact, but alive because she refused to let go. The chase dragged on the enemy, relentless, their weapons lighting up the night sky. The canyon twisted endlessly, each turn, a gamble each second, another heartbeat stolen from fate. The captain leaned forward, shouting over the roar, asking if she could hold them off, if she could last long enough to reach the drop zone. She gave no answer, her silence more telling than words, because she knew survival depended not on promises, but on every breath, every motion, every instinct she owned. The ground began to rise again, the canyon narrowing into a slit of darkness barely wide enough for the bird to pass. She guided it in without hesitation, her eyes sharp, her hands moving faster than thought. The walls scraped close, sparks flying as metal kissed stone, but still the helicopter surged forward. The enemy fighters hesitated, unwilling to risk pursuit into a death trap of rock and shadow. Yet hesitation was not retreat, and she knew they would be waiting once the canyon spat them out again. The alarms fell silent for a moment, leaving only the roar of rotors and the breath of men who realized how close they had come to death. The captain exhaled sharp, his shoulders tight, his eyes locked on her as though he had seen something beyond skill, something bordering on impossible. The SEALs whispered among themselves, their voices low, filled with both fear and awe. Yet their words were drowned by the storm still ahead, because the compound now loomed closer, and its defenses were Awake spotlights cut across the sky, sweeping over ridges and valleys, searching for the intruders that were already closing fast. The pilot lifted the bird higher, easing it from the canyon into open air, where the glow of the stronghold lit the horizon, like a predator waiting in the dark. Her heart pounded, her breath heavy, but her grip never loosened. The SEALs prepared weapons. The captain checked gear, his jaw hard as he leaned forward, eyes locked on the glowing fortress ahead, where they would, soon, drop into chaos. The radio burst alive with urgency. Enemy anti-air active, prepare for fire. The captain swore. The men braced, the pilot's eyes narrowed as she pulled the bird lower, skimming treetops that clawed at the steel frame. The fortress ahead grew larger, brighter, more dangerous. Every second. The SEALs tightened grips on rifles, their faces set with grim readiness, but their fate still tied to the hands guiding the machine forward. And as the first flash of anti-aircraft fire lit the sky, the bird shook violently, forcing the men back into their seats. The captain gritted his teeth. The pilot locked her eyes on the fortress, and the truth crashed over them all. The real battle had not even started yet. The fortress blazed against the horizon, a nest of lights and steel bristling with weapons, every spotlight sweeping across the night like a claw searching for prey. The female pilot guided the helicopter lower, skimming the treetops, her eyes sharp, her hands unyielding while alarms screamed across the cockpit. Enemy anti-aircraft fire erupted from the compound, fiery streaks tearing through the sky as the bird shuddered under the storm. The SEALs in the back gritted their teeth, tightening grips on their gear as they braced for the drop, and the captain leaned forward, his voice sharp, demanding answers on whether she could hold steady. She did not respond with words, her silence sharper than any promise. Instead, she tilted the machine into a roll that defied its design, forcing the bird to twist sideways as shells exploded around them. The cabin shook violently. Men slammed against harnesses. The captain's jaw clenched as he realized she was flying beyond limits, yet the bird obeyed her hands like it had been built for this alone. The fortress loomed closer, its guns alive, its defenses snarling with power. The SEALs felt the weight of every second, knowing that the moment of insertion would decide whether they lived or died. The first missile locked, on alarms, shrieking with piercing tones. The pilot dropped altitude hard, the helicopter plummeting toward the treetops with impossible speed. The SEALs shouted as branches scraped across the belly of the machine, sparks bursting into the air. The missile detonated behind them, the shock wave slamming into the bird, rattling bones and steel alike. Yet she forced the controls steady, dragging the bird forward through smoke and fire as the fortress roared against them, its guns turned with deadly hunger, ready for the next strike. The captain's voice cut through the storm, sharp and commanding. "Prepare for drop," he barked. The SEALs moved fast, strapping gear, checking weapons, their faces set grim and cold. The pilot guided the helicopter into the narrowest approach, a slice of ground hidden from the heaviest fire, a place where seconds mattered more than anything. She lowered the bird with surgical precision, her hands dancing over the controls, her eyes unblinking. The ground rushed up. The fortress looming overhead, shadows crawling across steel walls like predators waiting for the kill. The helicopter hit the ground hard, the skids grinding against dirt. The ramp dropped with a metallic scream, and the SEALs surged out into the night like shadows unleashed. They vanished into the darkness, their movements swift and precise, rifles raised, eyes scanning every angle. The captain was last to step off, but before he vanished, he turned back, his eyes locking on the pilot for one lingering second. It was not doubt in his stare now, but something closer to respect and maybe even awe. Then he was gone, swallowed by shadows and silence, leaving her alone in the machine with the storm still raging above. She lifted the bird back, into the air, immediately climbing fast as gunfire tore through the ground she had just vacated. The fortress guns roared, chasing her into the Skytracer rounds ripping across the horizon. The helicopter shook violently, every bone rattling under the storm, but she held steady, pushing it into evasive maneuvers that left even the fire control systems struggling to keep up. She knew her mission was only half complete. The hardest part was not bringing them in, but bringing them out alive, and the thought pressed on her chest like a weight that refused to lift. Minutes dragged like hours. The sky filled with thunder and fire. She weaved the helicopter between bursts of anti-aircraft fire, each turn sharper, each dive closer to death. The captain's voice came over the radio, broken by static. "We are inside the compound. Stand by for extraction." She acknowledged with a single word, her voice steady, though her hands trembled against controls that demanded perfection. The fortress below erupted in fire and smoke, the seals already deep within the storm, and she knew she had to keep the skies alive until they called for her return. Enemy aircraft roared in the distance, their engines cutting through the night. She spotted the glow of afterburners, closing fast, her heart slamming in her chest. The helicopter was no match in speed or firepower, but speed could be turned against them. She dropped altitude again, pulling into jagged terrain that forced the fighters higher unable to follow without risk. She skimmed the ground so low that branches snapped against the rotors, sparks flying again as the machine screamed under the strain. Yet the enemy did not relent, circling, waiting for their chance to strike. The fortress lit up, brighter explosions bursting across the compound. The captain's voice returned through static extraction point, compromised, moving to secondary location. His words carried urgency and strain, yet also certainty that they were still alive. The pilot banked hard, rerouting instantly, her hands moving faster than thought itself. She did not ask how much time she had. She did not need to know. The only truth was that she had to be there before the walls closed in around them. Gunfire erupted. Ahead, tracer rounds crisscrossing the sky. Enemy patrols were closing on the secondary point. Heavy fire concentrated on the landing zone. She clenched her jaw, dragging the bird lower, forcing it through streams of fire as alarms screamed again. The helicopter rattled, groaning under the storm, but her grip did not falter, not even as sparks showered the cockpit. The ground appeared fast, a clearing torn into the earth and already crawling with enemies. She felt her chest tighten, but pressed harder, pushing the machine down into the firestorm. The bird slammed into the ground harder this time, its frame shuddering against the impact. The ramp dropped instantly, and she shouted over comms, "Go, go, go!" Her voice cut sharp through the chaos. The SEALs burst from the shadows of the compound, racing toward the bird, their rifles spitting fire, their movements relentless. The captain led them, his face streaked with grit, his eyes blazing with fire. They poured into the helicopter one by one every second. A heartbeat stolen from fate. Gunfire tore through the air, bullets slamming against steel sparks, bursting across the cabin. The bird rocked under the assault men, shouting as rounds chewed the ground inches away. The captain shouted, all in," as he threw himself onto the ramp, pulling it closed with his own hands. The pilot slammed the controls forward, the helicopter lifting with brutal force as the fortress unleashed everything it had against them. The sky burned with fire. The machine rattled violently, yet she forced it higher faster, her breath heavy, her eyes unyielding. Missiles screamed again, locking onto their signal. The alarms howled in the cockpit, a shrill cry of death racing closer. The SEALs held their breath, bracing for impact, but she did not hesitate. She pulled the bird into a climb, then banked hard, forcing it through a gap between two ridges. The missiles followed too fast, too blind, detonating against the rocks in bursts of thunder and flame. The shockwave slammed, into them tossing the bird sideways, but she fought the controls, dragging it level again. Sweat poured down her face, her breath ragged, but her hands never left their grip. The radio crackled again, static breaking. Then the captain's voice, steady and sharp. Mission complete, package secured. Get us out now. The words struck like fire in her chest. She pushed the helicopter harder, forcing every ounce of power from the machine.